It's amazing to think now that there was a time in the Marvel Universe where Wolverine didn't exist. In fact, he made his debut in 1974. And it would be another year before he joined the fabled ranks of the X-Men. And after he made that leap, with each passing year his popularity grew, as did his character, his background and personality. And over the course of the next 30 to 40 years, Wolverine will become one of Marvel's top tier characters, one of the most popular characters, reaching something of a crescendo in the late 2000s, when the character seemed to be in virtually every Marvel book being produced at the time. He certainly was on a heck of a lot of teams, including both the X-Men and the Avengers. But surprisingly, despite being around the Marvel Universe for a good 10 years, Wolverine didn't get his first action figure until 1984 as part of the Secret Wars line. And it would then be another few years until Toy Biz got hold of the X-Men license before we started to see a proliferation of Wolverine toys, of which there seems to have been many ever since. So a few years ago, when Diamond Selected decided to acquire the Mego license to recreate some of the popular characters from the 1970s 8-inch toy line, they targeted Wolverine as a fantastic example of a toy that was never produced but was an opportunity to realise that figure at long last for long-term collectors. Now sadly, Diamond Select would only make a handful of these retro Mego style 8-inch action figures. But these weren't just straight re-releases, these were deluxe releases. The idea being that you'd essentially have 3 figures in one. You'd have the original, as close to the original release as possible, then there would be an alternate costume and an alter ego costume. There'd also be a collector book with a little bit of history about the company, about the figure and the character, and they'd all be presented in this rather collector-friendly packaging to display the figures. Now the packaging, as you can see, is quite long. It is a landscape design. It is obviously all window display, but there's so much colour and interest going on. We can see at least one of the figures and then the 2 alternate costumes in the packaging there. We can see all the various bits and pieces that it comes with: alternate hands, alternate heads. And the illustrations used throughout the packaging is reusing some of the core designs and images that were used in the 1970s. The reverse of the packaging is dedicated to this enlarged image of Wolverine, which seems to have been ripped directly from one of the X-Men comics of the 1970s. And this is really bright and colourful and really quite fun, and it's quite displayable. Now within the box there is another box. This is a much narrower, slimline box which has the figure in. Now in this case I've actually dressed him up as the civilian Wolverine, but I think he actually originally comes in the yellow spandex. And on the right here you'll see there is that magazine that I mentioned, which is quite nice, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. The smaller packaging is essentially just a scaled down version of what we see in the larger packaging, big window display, but on the side we have some other images of the other characters available in this line. So of course we have Captain America, Spider-Man and Thor. And then on the reverse of this packaging we have that same image of Wolverine, but this time it's a portrait image, and we can see the company's Diamond Select and MC logos. Now I did want to highlight briefly this magazine that comes with the figure, because this is a really nicely produced glossy magazine that's quite short but actually has quite a lot of fun information in for collectors. It has information talking about customs that were made because there were never any X-Men figures produced for the Mego line back in the day, and then it goes on to talk about the history of the character. It talks about the history of the action figures, all the various action figures we've had of Wolverine across the years, before finally talking you through the thinking behind this release. So I'm going to start off by looking at my personal favourite in this line, which is the civilian Wolverine. This is the alter ego Wolverine, I suppose, but I really love this costume and the work that's gone into this figure. I should mention there are actually 2 head sculpts that can be used with this body. There is the scowling Wolverine, as we can see here, and then there is basically the same face again, it's just non-scowling. I really like this head sculpt. I think they've done a very nice job of it all in all, although on this one I think you can see that the left eye looks a little bit too high than the right one, but that's a very minor gripe. All in all, this is a pretty good likeness of Wolverine. I think they've done a very nice job of recreating Logan here. And yeah, I think this works pretty well. Then we have his faux leather jacket, which is actually quite a stiff, sturdy material, which works really well. It looks really good. It looks quite authentic, and it has quite a nice texture to it as well. So I think they've done a very nice job of this. They've created a sort of fair collar as well, which is quite thin, but it looks pretty good. It looks the part, and as we can see on the back there, we can see it catches the light quite nicely, and it has that grain running through it, so it looks pretty authentic. This looks like it could be a leather jacket, and I think it's a cut above what we'd expect to see from a Mego release. And quite amazingly, he comes with 2 sets of closed fists, both with and without claws. And I have to say, I think they've done a tremendous job of these. Obviously, I really like the claws. I think they've just done an amazing job. The hands themselves are sculpted very nicely. There's lots of little details on there, lots of lines and patterning, which look pretty decent. But then we actually have the claws themselves, which look absolutely fantastic. They are individual. They look like they're coming out of their holders at their knuckles there, and they're painted very, very nicely in a sort of metallic silver paint. So they look absolutely brilliant. It seems to me that virtually every Wolverine figure I've ever owned has had a problem with at least one of the claws, where they're too close together or they snap off or whatever it might be. But in this case, they've got it pitch perfect, where these look really, really solid, and they just, perform exactly how they should. So I'm really, really super impressed with these. And then, of course, he's given these jeans, which are a very nice, thick cotton. They look pretty cool. There's some nice patterning around the cuffs and on the back of the jeans to replicate what we see in jeans. So I think they've done a really good job with this denim. And then, of course, he's given these boots as well. And there's a little bit of detailing on the boots. We can see the silver of the buckle there. And he stands very, very easily and well freestanding, and he doesn't require a stand. So I think they've done a fantastic job of balancing him, and the tailoring is pretty excellent for a figure of this scale. And of course, you can remove the leather jacket, so you can have Wolverine just in his vest here. And again, I think this looks pretty good. I think they've done a really solid job, and it feels like there's a number of different options in this one figure alone that makes him pretty interesting. I'll quickly run through the articulation just this once, because it is the same on all 3 versions of this figure, and you know what to expect if you've collected Mego figures in the past. But needless to say, he has a swivel at the neck, so his head can spin right the way around. He has a sort of ball joint in the shoulders, although obviously it's really just held together with elastic bands, so his arm can lift up, it can pop out and lift out to the side, and then he has a single joint at the elbow and a pin swivel at the wrist, so he can spin his wrist right the way around, and of course he can hinge it forwards and backwards as well. Now at the waist there is another ball joint, so he can rotate right the way around, he can move from side to side, he can bend forwards and backwards as well a little bit. He has more elastic bands holding his legs together at the top of his hips there, but it does allow his legs to kick out to the side. They can kick forwards a pretty healthy distance and backwards a little bit too. There's a single jointed knee, and then there is also a hinge at the ankle, but you can't really get the most out of it in the boots. Needless to say then, I absolutely love this figure, and particularly this version. The Logan in his civilian outfit is absolutely brilliant, top notch in my opinion. I think they've done a really fantastic job, and he stands above, the level of quality and detail is just a little bit above what you'd expect from a Mego release, so very, very impressed with this. I think he looks absolutely brilliant on display and a very welcome addition to the line. And then there's definitely a change of pace now as we look at the tiger suit, the yellow costume for Wolverine. Now, this was an attempt by Diamond Select to recreate what they think Wolverine might have looked like if he'd been released way back in the World's Greatest Superheroes line of the 1970s. And I think for some collectors this will be a huge bonus. People who really like that style will really appreciate the effort they've gone to here. For myself, it's definitely a little bit distracting, and it's my least favourite of the 3. So the most striking thing about this version, of course, is the mask that they've given him, which is quite a hard plastic. It is a little bit stretchy around the sides to allow it to be pulled on and off fairly easily, but obviously it's too big for the head. You can see there's lots of space swimming around the head there. Now the idea of this, of course, was to make sure that you could have different expressions, that you could remove the mask and you can have Wolverine with or without the mask, which is a really great move, a really great idea. It just doesn't work that well in practice, I feel personally. So it looks really clumsy to me, and it just looks silly. Wolverine just looks like he's got this huge head, which doesn't really quite work. Now, if you remove the mask, then I think it all looks good, and once again we're back on form. But this mask itself just looks silly to me. Now, it's a shame because I do think the costume itself is actually really quite nice. Yes, it's got that simple design that we'd see from the 1970s, but I think they've done a pretty faithful job that will please both comic book fans and Mego collectors from the 70s as well. I think this is nice and bright and colourful. It's a fairly accurate design with a tiger stripe. I really like that his belt is an extra piece and actually has that buckle on there as well, which looks really good. And the shoulder pads are very nicely done. They stick out properly. They're a different material, so it's a nice texture. And all in all, I think they've done a good job of this. But sadly, it falls down for me again when we look at the claws and the gauntlets, because they made the creative decision to try and replicate what would have been available and what style they may have chosen to use back in the 1970s. We have this rather oversimplistic design. So the gloves are a hollow piece that slide on and off the arms, so they don't really feel completely secure, and of course the claws themselves are one solid piece, so they look a bit clumsy, very toyetic, but not great by today's standards. And then we have the boots, which I think they've done a really good job of. This scene looks pretty decent to me. This looks pretty faithful, and as I said, I think this is the kind of thing that would please all fans, really. I don't think anyone would complain about this. And as a point of comparison, here he is standing next to one of the Marvel famous covers, 9-inch action figures from Toy Biz back in the 90s, which was in itself an update to the Mego style figures of the 1970s. As you can see, these are like night and day. They are so well apart, both in terms of scale, but body mold, costume, head sculpt, everything about these is completely different, and they are quite striking when you put them next to each other. So overall, I have to say, I think that this one is going to be divisive amongst collectors. Some people will probably really love it because they have tried to recreate that style from the 70s. For me personally, I just think it looks clumsy and it doesn't really quite work. And it's just, although it does have that toyetic quality, it's just not quite polished enough. So it just looks pretty lame, in my opinion. And then finally, we move on to the Tang costume. And for me, I think this is really a best of both worlds approach, where they combine all the best elements of both to try and keep everyone happy. And I think it's mostly very, very successful. For starters, in terms of the head sculpt, you'll notice, of course, that it is all one piece. So the mask is a sculpted headpiece. It is that rubber head there, but it looks to scale. They haven't bothered to try and make it a removable mask. It looks perfectly in scale with the rest of his body, and this looks pretty good. The only gripe I might have with this is that the orange on the top of the head is obviously a very strikingly different colour to the tan that we see on the rest of the body. So they're incongruous. They should be the same shade, in my opinion. But the rest of the costume is very nicely produced. It has that, made of that stretchy cotton, so it's got quite a nice texture to it. It's very bright and colourful, and it looks really good. And I really like the faux leather when it comes to the shoulder pads and the arm gauntlets. I think they've done a very nice job of this, and this works surprisingly well. And of course, it's all capped off with that a different belt that can strap around, and we're going to have that buckle on it, which is very nicely done. So all in all, this looks solid. And then we have the superbly sculpted hands. We actually have two alternate hands. We can have two open hands or two closed fists. Both sets have the claws, which again, like we saw in the civilian Logan figure, looks absolutely brilliant. So I think they've done a really nice job here. There's lots of different options that we're opening up here to be able to mix and match and create interesting different looks for the character, which is great. So really pleased that we got this. I think the sculpting's very, very nice, and yeah, these look excellent. The boots seem to be exactly the same as we saw on the yellow tiger stripe Wolverine costume. They're just painted differently, and that's absolutely fine because I think they work perfectly well. And then once again, as a point of comparison, here he is standing next to his equivalent from the Toy Biz Marvel famous covers line. As we can see, of course, it is a different scale. The Toy Biz version obviously towers above him, but it's just a very different look, a very different approach, and it's really quite striking when you put them next to each other, just how well apart they are. But nevertheless, fun to see. So for me, this tan version of Wolverine is a real success. I'm really, really very happy with this. I love that we have a little bit of interchangeability when it comes to the hands. I think the head sculpt works pretty well, aside from that minor gripe with the colouring. But all in all, I think this is a pretty faithful recreation of what we would expect to see from a Mego style Wolverine, but it's just a little bit enhanced, where it looks really good. So for me, this is a very happy medium between the two styles, and I really, really love it. And so there we have it, something of an experimental line that was sadly quite short-lived, but I really do appreciate the effort that they've gone to in trying to do something for everyone, trying to both update but remain faithful to the Mego style of the 1970s. I think they've done a fantastic job, and I think there's something here for everyone. There's definitely strengths and weaknesses, hits and misses, and a lot of that will depend on your own personal preference and what you want from a figure like this. But for me, I think there's enough in here to make him a real winner, and I think he's very, very fun, and I love the various different options that they've given and built into this figure. So all in all, I think they've done a pretty fantastic job. I'm really, really happy with this. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.